Bennett and Lapid are merging, Gantz's party is leaving him out to dry, and Smotrich is saying that Arab parties in the government would be worse than October 7th. So much has happened politically over the last week, but the question on everyone's mind is, will Netanyahu's almost 15-year Likud dynasty come to an end? This is the Deep Dive. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so happy to finally have an episode that's not entirely Iran-based. We can finally talk about some other fun things, like the very simple issue of Israel's Knesset. As I already said, so much has happened. It's very unclear what this means. Mergers, blocks leaving, blocks forming, who can stand to international pressure? We hope to answer all of these questions. To do so, we're joined by our Knesset correspondent, Keshet Neev. Keshet, welcome back.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us again. So we've had a very political last 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about Iran, what's going on in Strait of Hormuz, the U.S., Israel. Are we going to go back to war or are we not? While the jury's still out on that, in the meantime in Israel, there's been a lot of political moves happening. So, I'd love to kind of, really break those down and see what happened. I think obviously the top one here is the Bennett-Lapid merger.
Definitely.
The Yachad. Together. Isn't that sweet? So, on the one hand, this appears to be like the front runner to challenge Netanyahu and the Likud. On the other hand, a lot of people are skeptical because Lapid and Bennett had a merger before. They had a unity government. Didn't last that long. So there's kind of these questions about what's so different. You had the opportunity to interview Bennett. So
yes.
Talk us through it. What are your thoughts?
This merger definitely is a big game changer in these elections. I think that what we had before was basically Bennett running in his own party and Lapid separately. Now, Lapid already has a party in the Knesset, so he's the second largest party in the Knesset there. But what we were seeing was in polls, he was coming out, his Yesh Atid party was coming out at around 7 seats compared to the 24 that he has now in the Knesset. Whereas Bennett was coming out as one of the, just short of Netanyahu's Likud. So we definitely see the interest that Lapid has to join Bennett. And for Bennett, we have him here in the lead. He's leading this party and he's not willing to be second in command. So what we saw was that Bennett was calling on Eisenkot to join from Yashar, and Eisenkot, whose party is also one of the leading parties right now in the polls, he was not willing to join him up until now. And that was causing questions on if Bennett's party would actually be able to
unite this centrist kind of.
So I think what we're really seeing right now is a lot of talks of unity. I think a big aspect that we're seeing here in this party is the aspect of unity. So when I did get to speak to Bennett, he told me that a big part of coming together with Lapid was because the public is now thirsty for alliances, and that is what is going to gain the most amount of voters rather than division, especially after the country has been so divided on political matters for so long.
Right.
And we're seeing after October 7th and after all the judicial reform drama that was before. So now to see someone come in and really be speaking about unity and wanting to unite different political sides too, because Bennett is known for being, a right figure, a figure from the right, and whereas Lapid is more of a centrist party. However, now with them coming together, Bennett has said that, they have differences, but those differences are kind of what is making the alliance so great, and that's kind of what's going to rally all the voters and everything.
So, that brings a question about what do their platforms actually look like? Because on the one hand, both Bennett and Lapid and kind of any political, any party, basically their party leader is kind of running on these hot button issues like an October 7th probe, which still hasn't happened after over 2.5 years, which my personal opinion is insane. The Haredi draft issue is obviously a very big one because it's very pertinent right now. So there are very immediate issues that they're very vocal about addressing. But at the same time,
those are topics that are leading both of their campaigns.
Right. It's also kind of in the front of everyone's minds here in Israel about these issues, because they're up front and center. They're very present in our everyday lives. But as you mentioned, Bennett is a more right-wing figure, and Yesh Atid is more center kind of left. So does this look like this alliance is simply just to oust Netanyahu and find a solution to these hot button issues? Or is this going to actually stand the test of time this time, assuming they win? Will this actually stand the test of time and have a more well-rounded party? Because, historically, governments in this country don't tend to last their term. They tend to fall apart rather quickly, actually.
And that's what happened last time with Bennett and Lapid.
Exactly.
What Bennett is saying from all this is that he is sure that this can last. It's also important to note that this is like a technical merger. Mm-hmm. So the Yesh Atid party is still existing, mm-hmm. just within Bennett's, the overall Together party. Mm-hmm. So that still gives Yesh Atid a lot of, ground. It gives them seats. It gives them...
they can make their demands.
Yeah, they can make their demands. And their members of Knesset who are in the Knesset right now are very active, and they're very in the forefront of the opposition, I would say. So they will still, get representation of sorts, though it's not clear exactly how it will work.
So speaking of the representation, something that interests me personally is that if you look at who's joining Bennett's party, or who has announced has joined his party already, aren't these well-known political figures and former members of Knesset that people immediately associate with a party or whatever? Instead, he's bringing on these former director generals of these ministries. So yes. Rather than having just a blanket politician, these are people who are actually doing the groundwork and kind of managing these ministries. So on the one hand, I see that as an appealing kind of factor, because he's saying, I'm not bringing celebrities, I'm bringing people who know how to do the work and know the job. On the other hand, a big element of the nature of forming a coalition in Israel is that different parties demand different seats, different ministries. So how would it play out that some of these parties that Bennett would want in his coalition might want some of these seats that he has these former director generals on? Would he still be able to appoint these director generals to the ministries that they worked at and know very well? Or would it kind of get muddled up because they have to play politics and give it to other people? And is there any merit in that then?
Right. So that is something that we won't be able to know until, later on, how exactly things will go. I think, the way it works is that every party has their list of who's on the list, of who's in their party.
Yeah.
So the thing about Bennett and Lapid's merger is that it hasn't been disclosed how the details of who got how many seats, who got this, who got that, and they're not answering, to the exact details. So it will just depend on that agreement a lot, and also on which number and which slot every edition was put on in their list.
So obviously at some point they kind of have to reveal this list anyway.
Right.
So the voters know what they're getting, but do you think that this is going to be the kind of card they leave in their pocket until the very end to kind of just build this momentum on these hot topic issues? Or do you think we'll see some announcents pretty soon about what this actual merger and breakup looks like, so people can really understand what they're voting for?
I think that we'll see. I think that what we'll see soon will also depend on Gadi Eisenkot a lot.
Okay.
Because if Bennett and Lapid have both called on Eisenkot to join the party, and they've also said that the door is still open for him and they've left a slot for him. Eisenkot has now also released a list of the people who are starting to join his party.
Right.
Which kind of has a similar feel to it. Also former government director generals. We have bereaved family members and people affected by the October 7th attacks. He also said that he was going to start bringing younger people into the party, which is what Bennett did when he brought in a youth organization, Katef El Katef. We're seeing a lot of similarities there. So if Eisenkot is to end up merging into their party, then that's going to totally shift the entire way of how their party will look and who will be on the list. Lapid has said that he's willing to actually go from being second on the list to being third in order to let Eisenkot come in and be second, which is a really big thing, because not only is Lapid stepping aside here for this entire merger, and by the way, this isn't a rotation government this time where Lapid would get to be prime minister for a certain amount of time. This is straight up all Bennett.
Right.
And Lapid has agreed to that. So Lapid willing to drop down a slot even further to be third really kind of shows, the framing that they're going with is that Lapid is putting his ego aside and really making room for Eisenkot to join so that there can be unity, so that the opposition can really manage to oust Netanyahu this time around.
I see. So, as we said up until this point, Eisenkot still hasn't joined. If he ultimately decides not to, or he straight up announces that he's not going to, like definitively that he won't, could that potentially damage this kind of united centrist front?
I think that it can definitely change the direction of the opposition bloc as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you said earlier, the battle is also after the elections when it comes to actually forming the government,
right,
and who's going to be able to form the coalition and bring all the parties together. In the last time that Ben became prime minister, he actually only won 6 seats, but he was the one who was actually able to come together and bring all the parties together. So I think that there's 2 aspects. There's the aspects of the before the elections, and then there's the aspect of the after elections, and whether Eisenkot will be part of their party or not will be a big factor about how those negotiations will go afterwards.
Right. So speaking of coalition forming and the political parties that we're talking about, in the last government that they went together, the unity government, that also included the Ram party, right, with Mansour Abbas, and another one of the most prominent political stories of this week was Finance Minister Smotrich asked, what would be worse, forming a government with Mansour Abbas or the October 7th massacre? And then he answered his own question saying, obviously forming a government with Mansour Abbas, to which naturally this received a lot of political backlash.
Yes.
So I could talk about this statement for hours.
Right.
But before I get into that, what I want to know is, if we look at like the current political climate from like the sense of what the citizens of Israel care about, we see that they're still reeling from October 7th. It's still a very relevant topic. You don't hear about it as often, but like the Gaza ceasefire is still very fragile, very much in trouble. The border peace we're not out of the woods yet. So from a political side, I don't know if this is in like polls or anything, but like has there been any backlash or negative effect from that statement, or maybe in some weird way like the opposite? Like did Smotrich's statement in any way affect his party, his chances, anything?
I think that, obviously the opposition bloc was quick to condemn these statements, and Bennett was one of the people who really said, this is actually the government trying to rework the narrative, like they're continuing to try to rework the narrative of October 7th to not take accountability for government failures.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of been a long ongoing argument that's been going on, and with the State Commission of Inquiry and everything that we have still not done. So it's a big part of the opposition's campaign is, they call it the October 7th government, and they call it the October 7th Prime Minister, Liberman today was just saying. And it's very in the forefront, October 7th, in this whole election campaign. It's something that I think has never been, it obviously has never been before, and
right,
that's changing everything. I think what we're seeing from the other side of the coalition government ministers is they're using October 7th kind of as a way to remind the public of the fact that Lapid and Bennett had partnered with the Arab Ram party, and there's been a lot of posts. I think AI is a huge part of this election, and we were seeing AI of Mansour Abbas, the Ram party leader, in a marriage ceremony with
Lapid and Bennett.
Yes, things like that. It's all part of their way to kind of use October 7th almost as a way to remind the past about the Arab parties and to touch on that sensitive topic, and that's kind of leading their campaign against Bennett and Lapid. Whereas for the opposition bloc, it's the opposite in terms of they're saying that no, like the government is responsible for October 7th failures, and they need to take accountability. So
I see. I'm going to jump in for a bit and say, like, obviously there's this kind of weird line where October 7th has to be addressed as a political issue because, you know, it did very much happen, and there are still, like, after effects of it that Israel is still dealing with or has to deal with. So it makes sense that, you know, any party that's running in the current election has to address it. So it's kind of hard to do that without politicizing it. I'm not really a fan of the politicization that's kind of happening on both sides. But what I will say, and, you know, this is also in line with, like, the editorial that we put out,
right,
is that I just think that, like, this is, like, one of the most absurd statements I've, like, heard from a minister probably ever.
And he really pushed on it too.
Yeah.
You know, you hear the interview. I really heard the whole clip, and the interviewers ask him, you know, like, you know that, like, thousands of people were people were murdered, hostages, bereaved families, and he's like, yes, and he goes further with it, you know.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like, first of all, I think we have to point out, like, the most absurd fact of all of this, which is that, like, in a lot of polls, the projection is that, like, if Bennett wins, he can form a coalition without Arab parties. So this isn't even, like, a relevant factor. So they're kind of, like, just clinging on to the fact that the unity government did have Ram in it. But
well, it's a big question if he will be able to form the
no,
government.
it's a
without the Arab
question,
parties.
but
they're vowing, they're really, and, you know, part of their campaign is that they won't do it this time. No,
right.
You know.
But what blows my mind is that they already had a government with Ram, and we already had October 7th. I think it's very clear what was worse. I'm not advocating for a government with Ram party by any means.
Oh, yeah.
But it's like, it's very clear that in those few brief months that Ram was in the government, literally nothing happened. And then there was the Holocaust 2.0. So I don't.
And also the government that was, you know, in charge at that time was not the government that had Ram in it. So it's all very interesting.
Yeah, I saw it. I was very confused. I think if you're trying to shift away from responsibility of October 7th, I think giving a very clear counterfactual is not the best way to do it. But we'll see if it ends up hurting him in the long run or not. I think at the moment we're all just a bit dazed by it because I guess, and this is my opinion, not the J Post, but what a dumb thing to say. Moving on.
Definitely.
You know, other parties have been making a lot of political moves. As you said, you know, Eisenkot is picking up steam. They just announced that former Shin Bet director Iram Cohen announced, I think it was last night.
It was yesterday. They held a joint press conference together.
Yeah.
And answered on questions
together. So he's kind of touting that, you know, he has all this, like, security background, so he's tapping into this, like, you know, security is still the number one priority. You know, interestingly, as you mentioned earlier, we see a bunch of people joining politics who aren't your routine politicians or career politicians. Right. You're seeing, you know, like, members, like hostage families or, like, bereaved family members are really taking an active voice. You know, Yoaz Hendel and Miluimnikim are making it a very big issue. So it's really interesting that obviously I kind of think that every party's sort of following everyone else, and, like, this is, like, the week that we've started all saying our stuff. But it appears to be that, like, mainstream politics now is very much turned into this generation of, like, post-October 7th. You know, I think all the parties
there's no way to avoid it because that's the reality that we're living in now, and that's also the representation that people want to see in the Knesset right now. You know, we want to see people who actually were impacted by the war and who actually want to speak up for the people who were impacted by the war and for the bereaved families. And I think that Bennett added Yonatan Shalev. He's from the Katef El Katef organization, which is, he's 23 years old. He's very young. But I think that, you know, to see someone who was active in the army and who was, you know, fought in the wars and who was actually on the ground, I think that's kind of a breath of fresh air for people who are just used to seeing these politicians who just kind of are a little bit out of touch with the reality of, you know, what's been going on in this country, and the impact of the war. And I think that also we've been seeing a lot of talk about post-trauma and rehabilitation. One of the additions to Eisenkot's list was a former director general who was in charge of the welfare ministry. So he kind of has a whole plan, he said, to have like a post-trauma rehabilitation plan for people who suffered from the attacks, and for people who were affected by the war. And I think that that's very much in the forefront, and that's very much what people want to see. And it's kind of hard to avoid,
But on the other hand, like, obviously it's so hard to avoid, and it's obviously what people want. It's obviously the most pressing thing. And, like, I don't know, I feel maybe I might be asking too much here, but I feel like for the past very long time, Israel's governments have very much kind of only addressed, like, what's in front of them in the here and now.
Right.
And so while obviously I think all of these things should be addressed, if you look at this new, like, generation of politics rising from, October 7th and, like, the subsequential wars, it's like, are any, like, socioeconomic issues going to be addressed? Or, like, the road's going to be fixed? You know what I mean? Because, like,
right.
I've lived here for almost 11 years, and, like, up until now it's been, like, no. Because we always had to deal with security. So it's like, I hope security is dealt with better than it was 2.5 years ago, but, like, I also still, like, want a government that has, like, the foresight to acknowledge that, like, there actually is still just, like, an everyday country that needs to be addressed. And the question is, like, can, political parties or ideologies or, like, members of Knesset who have joined from the standpoint of, like, the national identity is, like, post-October 7th, can we actually expect any of these, like, other things to actually be addressed?
So I will say that it's not that these other issues haven't been part of other party members' campaigns. It's not that they haven't been mentioned. I just think that they're a little less in the headlines. Right now, the headlines are very, like, we got to replace the Netanyahu government, and it's very, like, anti-Netanyahu.
Probe this,
yes,
figure that.
And I think that the other headlines of the actual policies that these politicians want to push for kind of slip under the surface, or kind of, they're, like, at the bottom of the article because, like, people really want to hear about all the juicy, alliances and all of, those aspects.
Of course. So are there, like, any kind of more boring but necessary everyday policy platforms that, like, you've seen people talk about?
So I will say that when I spoke to Bennett, he said that he actually called the transportation in Israel, like, a third world country. And he said that...
That's an insult to third world countries.
Yeah. So he actually said that he has come up with a plan to repair that. He laid out kind of a few things that he's going to do. So there were, like, the first immediate things, of course, like State Commission of Inquiry, wants to limit also the time that a prime minister can be in power. Which is a big thing because we know that Netanyahu has been
massive,
there. Yeah, so he said he wants to do that on day one. So there's day one type of things, and then he said he kind of has, like, flagship ideas that are more big. One of them, a lot of what I've been hearing in a lot of different campaigns is about addressing the crime rates in Israel, which have really gone up. And that is a big part of Bennett's campaign. Today, Liberman, who's the head of the Israel Beitenu party, he also said that is going to be a big part of his campaign as well, and to reduce, like, the crime organizations that are here. Another part of Bennett's campaign is that he's been saying that he wants to have ministers who actually know how to do their job.
Right.
He called National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who oversees the police, a clown. So he said that, like, Israel is going to have to get used to, us having ministers who actually know what they're doing, and that's also why he's bringing in, former government director general. So I don't think that, like, the issue of policies is, I don't think that policies are not on the table. I just think that they're just not being brought to light so much, and that people aren't so interested in reading them, honestly.
Well, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah.
So lastly, there's, I guess I would say a key player that we really haven't talked about so much yet in this episode, and that's Benny Gantz. And
or former key player, we could say.
Former key player. When immediately after the war, he was one of the three ministers. It was him, Netanyahu, and Yoav Gallant, who essentially formed this like super metzumtzam security cabinet decision making.
Yeah.
He was like one of the three men, kind of essentially making the key decisions at the beginning of the war after October 7th, including offensives into Gaza, including negotiations for hostage. Like he was one of the main policymakers, and now it seems to be that everyone is jumping ship from his party.
Yeah.
So, after being in the top three most important decision-making, politicians of the country, we're now faced with this question of, like, does Benny Gantz have a political future in the next election?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that this week especially, it really felt that, people were just dropping like flies from his party. Like, we had 2 departures in 1 week, and that comes after a series of previous departures with members of Knesset who are now actually in Gadi Eisenkot's party.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the biggest loss, which was Gadi Eisenkot himself, who was Gantz's second in command in the party.
And now he's like trumping him in all the polls.
Yeah, total. Like, so the thing with Benny Gantz's blue and white party is that it's failing to pass the electoral threshold needed to actually get into the Knesset. And that actually poses a risk to the opposition bloc itself, because what can happen is that if Benny Gantz runs in the elections and people vote for him, and they want the opposition bloc to succeed,
right?
And then he ends up not passing the threshold, then all those votes will have gone to nothing.
Just go to waste,
Exactly. And so now what we're seeing is what Eisenkot has been saying, and also Yair Lapid said in an interview today, party leaders who their party is like not passing the threshold, that they either need to merge and align with a different party, or they need to just drop out and resign, because it could actually risk the future of the opposition bloc. Now, what's also interesting about Benny Gantz is the fact that he's not really in the opposition bloc anymore, even.
Yeah.
Because his stance, he's indicated that he would be willing to partner with Netanyahu and form a coalition with him.
I mean, he's kind of already done it, like, sort of, like,
So that's the thing. He's done it, and this is a big thing that has brought a lot of criticism from the public.
Right.
Is his back and forth approach, where one day he's forming he's joining Netanyahu, and then the next day he's saying, I can't be with his policies, and that's why he left Netanyahu and the unity government. He said he couldn't, follow his decisions, and I think that people kind of want to see more of a decisive figure and someone who can, address hard topics. And what we're seeing with Gantz is kind of this wishy-washy approach, where now he's calling for something called a broad Zionist government, which again sounds like something that could involve Netanyahu, and that's just not what people really want to see. And I think that he's lost a lot of credibility, and I think all the departures of people leaving his party has kind of like left him very isolated, and we just kind of imagine him like sitting alone almost at this point, like,
It's a really interesting dichotomy, because obviously Gallant is out, but if you look at Gantz and Netanyahu, on Netanyahu's end, he's made a rather historic political comeback. I think, on October 7th, October 8th, in between all of the very horrible negative feelings, emotions that we've all never felt ever, in the middle of all of that, somewhere in our minds, we were all kind of thinking like, oh, so Netanyahu's done for. He's supposed to be Mr. Security, and that happened. But at least for his base, he's made,
and protests calling to replace him, and
of course, and he's made one of the biggest comebacks for his base. He was featured on Time magazine as one of the most influential people here because of his comeback. And on the other hand, you look at Gantz, who was, while not necessarily in one would latch responsibility onto, he was the one, he was in the early decision making of the war, and his support is essentially like zip to none.
Right.
So that is just the question, is he going to stick to his guns and continue to run, or is he going to merge or drop out?
So that is the big question now. Like, are we going to really see Gantz, a list with Gantz, when we're voting in the elections? And the thing about Gantz and what he's saying now is that he's like not dropping out, and he's very adamant about the fact that he's continuing. And I mean, by the time this is published, maybe something will have happened and he'll already have resigned. We don't know. But he's very like, you know, that's how fast things shift around. But he's very adamant on the fact that he's continuing. There was a report, though, that was saying that he was conducting talks that he was conducting talks about possibly resigning and dropping out of the election. And right away, he released a statement saying that that is completely false and an absolute lie. So he's been very adamant on the fact that he's staying in the race. Other members from his party who remain have said that they're looking into alliances and that they're acting responsibly in a way that, you know, they're not going to cause, you know, public votes to be lost. So there are talks about different alliances that he might join in different parties, reports about him maybe joining the reservists, which are also not passing the threshold either necessary. So it's kind of like, you know, in the air. But according to Benny Gantz, he says he's staying in the race.
He's in it for the long run.
Yeah, he's in it.
So I get, we'll wait and see.
I think we'll wait and see.
I think the last thing that we have to talk about is, you know, I haven't necessarily seen this through any kind of like poll, but like of people who I speak to, who are definitely voting for Likud, who are voting for Netanyahu. One of the main factors is that, you know, if we're talking about, you know, immediate issues that have to be addressed, have to be resolved, have to be, you know, looked after, there's the very real topic of Iran. I hate that every episode I do always ends up going back to Iran.
It always
goes
back to
It is what it
Iran.
is. Like, we have to address it. But, you know, at the moment right now, we are very much still in a very fragile, shaky ceasefire with both Lebanon and Iran that could break at any moment.
Right.
If you ask me, I don't think it's going to last. I think, you know, the continued strikes from Iran on the UAE is not good.
Not a good side.
I think just the way of the negotiations, it just doesn't seem like anything good is happening to the point where the U.S. or Israel will have to resume striking. Otherwise, it would just be disrespectful that they have whatever. But that being said, I don't see this Iran issue being resolved before elections. I think it would be naive to assume that. And obviously, if you look at Netanyahu, that is like the issue right now because we're in the middle of it.
Right.
But, you know, all these other parties like rushing to oust Netanyahu so that they could take all these actions and do all these kind of things. What are they saying about Iran? Are they going to continue the Iran issue? Are they going to drop it and focus on what's home? Are they purposely staying silent on it? Like, what's going on there? Because, like, I feel like we can't ignore that.
The thing about the opposition bloc right now is it's kind of has, like, we have one side that is super, like, a right-wing party. We have Yisrael Beitenu, super right-wing, hardcore.
Liberman is, like, number one Iran.
Yes, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Exactly. And then we have here, like, Yair Golan, who's the head of the left-wing Democrats party, who's calling more for a diplomatic deal and pushing, you know, for something of the sorts.
Right.
So I think what we're seeing is the opposition is very much, you know, criticizing Netanyahu about his conduct in the war. They're just kind of doing it in different ways. So what we're seeing right now is from the side of Liberman, just today he held a press conference and he launched a new campaign called It's Time for a Decisive Outcome. And what he was basically saying is he was criticizing the fact that we're going into round after round of different military operations, you know, different rounds against Iran, and Hamas and Hezbollah. He's
and the
had all the
Houthis.
fronts. Yeah, exactly. And each time we're not coming out with a sense of like satisfaction in terms of like, okay, we've eliminated Hamas, we've ended the Iranian regime. According to Liberman, it's possible to end the Iranian regime, and that we have not, you know, been we have not been conducting ourselves properly to actually do that. And then we have like the more like the other side, where I was saying about Golan, who's more, you know, like a left wing. He's the leader of the left wing party, so he's criticized the fact that we haven't worked harder for a diplomatic deal with Lebanon. And that's been one of his like core criticisms. So I think that there is criticism towards Netanyahu. it was interesting that at the beginning of the Iran war, like Bennett-Lapid, everyone was very much backing Netanyahu at the time. And they were doing like interview rounds with like international media, like backing Israel.
Similar to October 8th.
Yes.
Everyone was very much on board.
Exactly. I would say the difference here is that really lasted, this time around, it really did not last very long. It was about, I want to say, like one nice week of unity maybe. Yeah. And then afterwards, we were already hearing criticism about different, issues throughout the war, that the government was, not focusing enough on the war issues, was advancing like controversial legislation in the Knesset at the time of the beginning of the war. And a lot of issues with the frameworks for compensation and things like that for people who were impacted by the war. That was like a big criticism from the opposition as well. So I think that, Iran is very much at the forefront and Netanyahu is leading that, but there's still a lot of criticism to go around.
No, but then that brings up the question, so that I think if, anyone who's not being disingenuous can say that, whether you think the way Israel's been conducting itself in these wars was like proper or not, I think it's very clear that there has been an element of indecisiveness and an element of kind of, as long as it's prolonged, we don't have to back out. And there isn't really a clear option forward, and maybe the goals that the government set that to achieve were a little too high. But that being said, I also think that no matter how we feel one way or another, should we continue, should we end, all opinions welcome. I think there's a consensus that one of the worst things that could happen is that, if international pressure or like another country essentially stops Israel before it makes its decision. Meaning if Israel wants to stop, it should do so on its own terms. If Israel wants to continue or decisively finish a conflict, it should also do so on its own terms. But, having someone else dictate for us is a very bad outcome.
Right.
And, historically, Netanyahu has been very strong at holding off on international pressure, very strong on, standing up to the United States. He notoriously stood up against Biden and Obama.
Right.
A lot of instances against Trump. There was the most recent Lebanon ceasefire, which I was very critical about in the last episode. I will continue to be critical about. I think it's one of the most embarrassing moments in the country's history. But besides that,
right.
His track record is more passing than failing when it comes to not succumbing to international pressure. But that being said, if we're talking about the potential of having a new prime minister, someone who hasn't been in the arena so much, the question is there someone else who could actually stand up to all this international pressure, especially after October 7th, especially after 2.5 years of war, when international pressure has never been higher?
Yeah.
And Israel's never been more isolated.
I think that's a great question. I think that it's also kind of the question that I hear a lot of people say, who else but Bibi? Who else is there to
right.
be the leader? Who else could do it? I think that in this election, I think there was even a poll that was saying that, people see Bennett as a very viable option to be able to do that. And it's interesting, but when Liberman was, when Liberman launched his campaign today, he said that he has two goals and that one of them is to become prime minister. So the other opposition leaders, they don't rule themselves out as prime minister. So just because right now Bennett is leading, Liberman still has this goal to become prime minister. And Eisenkot also hasn't agreed to do the merger because he said that he just doesn't want to be the second command anymore.
Right.
But as I said, he was the second command in Gantz's party, and Bennett is not willing to give up the prime minister spot, no matter what. The first spot. So even if Eisenkot were to join Bennett, it would be second on the list.
Right.
So I think that it's very interesting to kind of see this dynamic of who in the opposition could maybe be, the next prime minister. And I will say that Netanyahu still is kind of seen as a figure that is the only one, though, for some,
right.
Well,
I for one, I'm excited that this is starting to pick back up. Because I love politics. I love Israeli politics.
Yeah.
I love talking about something that isn't just war all the time.
Yeah.
But, together with that, it just means that the news is going to be ever more hectic because...
Right. This is like a whole different angle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially after the announcement of the merger between Bennett and Lapid, the election talk has just been, through the roof. And also the competition of, adding new party members all the time. Like every day a new party member is joining one of these parties. Again, some really interesting ones, some bereaved families. We have Sharon Sharabi, who is the brother of former hostage Eli Sharabi. He joined Liberman's party.
Mm-hmm.
So every day we're seeing like different additions, and it's really like starting to pick up. Lots of different reports about different types of mergers. We were hearing also that maybe Liberman would merge with Eisenkot. There were reports on that. And Liberman, today in the press conference, he didn't deny that could be an option. He said that they were just working to kind of find the best way to have the opposition bloc be able to win. So they said that whatever will cause the opposition bloc to win, they're going to do. So I think it's really interesting to see also the future alliances that are going to come together. Are we going to see Gantz in the game? Is he going to merge? And obviously the bigger fish of Eisenkot, Liberman, and if Eisenkot will do that merger in the end of the day. These are like things that can really change the direction of the elections.
Absolutely. And I think, the most important thing is that historically, as election dates draw near, there's usually some kind of security event, whether it be rockets from Gaza or we have to start calling up reserves to send them back to Lebanon. It's not always from us. It's also Israel's enemies are also always paying close attention to the news, and they know as election draw near, they tend to cause as much trouble as possible.
And some say that also Netanyahu has, coordinated things with the Iran war to kind of match with the election schedule. Obviously, these are speculations, but there's a lot to it.
But I think it's a safe assumption that in between now and elections, something will happen. So I hope that things stay quiet so we can focus on politics for politics and not for security.
Yes. Definitely lighter matter.
But I think we could agree that this is just kind of like the kickoff of election season, and it's only going to go up and up and up, and announcements are going to start coming out like crazy, and it'll be fun to check.
And then there's going to have to be the time, obviously where the lists are given and we know who exactly are has signed up and which parties. So there's
and that's
a lot
when the personal attacks start coming out.
Yeah,
and everyone has a field day.
That's gonna be like full on a different thing. I think it's gonna be interesting. Summer it seems to be.
But I think it's safe to assume that it's definitely like the season has started.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I don't know. Maybe this week we'll have more surprises in store. Maybe next week.
You never know. Like again, every day, like really, I feel like I wake up and it's like a fresh day, and I really don't know what's gonna happen sometimes. And again, there's like a lot of reports out there that are, sometimes just not correct or just speculation, and a lot of fake, things, and a lot of, so I think it's important to kind of beware of that also. Keep an eye out, not believe everything you see right away.
And it's just good advice in general.
In general.
The way people consume media today, it's very much, so, we'll continue to follow, but it's gonna get wild.
And also, I also want to say it's important to look out for the actual policies. Again, like I was saying earlier, there's like a lot of talk about, the Netanyahu bloc and everything, but I think that it's interesting to see, like, who is saying what they're actually going to do. Like you were saying about, doing things that this country actually needs, things we actually want to see, cost of living, things like that. So I think that's also
I've been advocating for that my whole life, and I hope people will join me in caring about the everyday things.
Yeah, I'll hold up a side with you, Jake.
I think especially from like abroad, you kind of just assume that Israel's constantly at war and it's just like explosions everywhere and whatever, but like in between there's just like the day-to-day thing needs to be fixed too. Obviously not as urgent as some other things, but who knows?
It's definitely very important. Like we are a functioning country, and even when we're at war, things seem to function more or less. People go to work, and that's the reality of living here. So I think that we need to, have some leaders who can look out for us and have our back and what we need.
Yeah. So we'll see how it plays out. But
we really will.
Yeah, thank you for setting the record straight, clearing all this up. I think there's too many parties in the system.
Oh
so
my
it's
gosh.
A little,
and they're talking about
that's a whole other episode.
And they're talking about more parties.
Yeah.
That's a whole other
That's a whole,
episode.
maybe when we're not in war, we could have a whole special on that. But for now, at least we've
By
done
the
order.
next episode, there may be a new party that we didn't even address today.
Nachon. So I guess we'll see. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jake. This has been great.
We'll be back next week to cover the inevitable 600 or so political developments that will happen in that time. But in the meantime, visit jpost.com to stay up to date for the latest news in Israel.